All right, welcome to the Talk to Me Petey D podcast. I'm your host, Petey D. This is my podcast where I talk about people management, leadership, productivity, AI, and whatever's top of mind. So today is episode 23. We're going to talk about the reading that I did in January 2025. Last year in 2024, I set a goal to read 60 books, reading about 5 a month. I'm purposely not setting that goal for 2025, or at least in theory not setting that goal, so I can focus on other things. I believe when you're prioritizing, you have to say no to some things. Not everything can be a priority all the time. So that specific reading goal is not a priority for me in 2025, although I'm going to try and keep a similar pace, but maybe just not hold myself to it in quite the same way. Reading has been incredibly influential and continues to be incredibly influential and important for me, both in my professional life and in my personal life. It's really helped me develop a leadership and management philosophy. I think increasingly as we move into the age of AI, skills like critical thinking, empathy, human understanding are going to increasingly be important. And you can develop a lot of these through a reading practice, both in the specific material that you're reading, but also just in the way that you're exercising your brain has been shown to translate into developing those skills. So I would encourage everyone to do it. It's also a great way to connect. A lot of the books that I read come as recommendations from friends and colleagues, and it's a great way to get to kind of know a bit more about them, what's interesting to them, and share those conversations. So if you have reading you like, feel free to pass it my way. I hope you'll find some of these books interesting. Maybe you can pick them up. Leave me a comment or send me a note if you have thoughts on these. So, all right, here we go. So 5 books in January 2025, keeping the same pace as last year, even though that's not the goal. Book number 1. The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie. So again, this was a recommendation I got. I was having a conversation with a colleague of mine who is a Native American, and was sort of asking, what's a good book to read to kind of understand a little bit more about that experience. So this was his recommendation there. I really enjoyed it. It's got a good amount of teenage humor and things like that. So while it's educational, it's also really funny and enjoyable to read. It's, one of the kind of themes in it that I really liked as well is that education is a path to freedom. And for some of us, education is something that we take for granted. We've always had, the privilege of access to it, but that's not always true for everyone. And different people have to go through different links in order to be able to access education in the way that some of us do, sort of for free. So I really appreciate that, and it helps motivate me to continue learning as an adult and continue my reading practice. This story is sort of a tale of someone living in two worlds, living on a Native American reservation, and then also kind of going to school in the mostly white world outside of that, and sort of feeling both accepted and an outsider in both of those places. So really interesting dynamic. One of the things that was cool about this book too that I liked is that the protagonist draws a lot, and there is an illustrator that works along with the author to bring those into the story, and it really complements the way that the information is delivered really nicely, and adds a lot to the experience. So I'll leave you with a quote that I liked from that. Life is a constant struggle between being an individual and being a member of a community. So enjoy that one a lot. Check it out. Up next, Day Trading Attention by Gary Vaynerchuk. I did a separate one on this after I read it, but I'll talk about it here as well. So creating content like this, writing some other things on various social channels has gotten me sort of more interested in the professional side of social media, which is why I picked up this book. It's interesting because in a lot of ways I'm hesitant to kind of spend too much time there, but I also see the power of it as a way to reach an audience, to be able to get content out there, market yourself, build a personal brand, be a thought leader. So good and bad side to it. But what I really liked about this book is it's really taking a professional approach to it and looking at it like you were a marketing team, and understanding sort of differences of some of the social platforms out there, how you can leverage them, really interesting if you're not familiar with it, sort of the shift that TikTok has brought along to move to the attention graph as opposed to more of the relationship based content delivery that we saw earlier on when social platforms took off. So, interesting to read about that. You can think about how you want to experiment with your content and try and utilize the different platforms depending on what you're trying to do, what type of audience you're trying to reach. So I enjoyed that a lot. Let me see. Yeah, I mean, it's again a very experimental approach. So similar to books on innovation, or if you're in a field where you're trying to innovate or take more a scientific approach to experiments where you might try something and it might quote unquote fail, but you learn something valuable from that. There's a very similar approach to marketing and social media that's recommended in day trading attention. So if you're interested in the social space, you're creating content, or you just want to understand more as or be a more informed consumer of social media, it's a good book to read. It's a little bit dry, which is interesting because I think Gary is a very dynamic and funny speaker. But this book is more business, which is good. It's appropriate for it. So, book number 2. Book number 3, Slaying Leviathan by Glenn S. Sunshine. This has been on my list for a while, so I finally got to it. It's a interesting look at sort of the balance in power between the state and the church and where those boundaries have been drawn over time, and how they've moved around, and kind of different ways to think about what's appropriate for each of those to manage in a society. It's a more Western focused book, so it's sort of looking at government and the church in Western society as opposed to other places. It came out right around sort of the end of the pandemic, so I was curious how much of a sort of political angle it would have around sort of government restrictions and things on that time. There's a little bit about that, but not too much. It's really a very historical book, which was interesting. I don't know a whole lot about sort of history in general and kind of players there, so it was good for me to read, and kind of interesting how things have evolved over time. So it sort of walks through the balance of power between church and state, different philosophers, different perspectives on how, what's appropriate for the church to govern and what's appropriate for the state to govern, how that's changed over time, and how that led up to, the forming of the United States, the Declaration of Independence, and a lot of the philosophy that went into the founding of the United States. So, very interesting read if you like history. You like that one. It's kind of obscure. I haven't really seen it mentioned in a lot of places, but I enjoyed reading it and learned a lot. Book number 4, Bird by Bird, Anne Lamott. So this was actually a impulse buy. I was walking through a local bookstore and I saw this. I write, so I like books on writing. They're actually some of the funniest and most insightful books just kind of in general about life that I've read. This one's no exception. There are a lot of parallels that I find in books about writing instruction or setting up a writing life to productivity, because you have to be very organized. You have to schedule things. You have to show up and write when maybe you don't want to. So if you're interested in sort of productivity reading, you're going to find a lot of parallels in books on writing or how to be a writer. A lot of it focuses on personal narrative and how to tell your own story, which I think is useful sort of as a leader, right? If you're trying to show up authentically and be able to talk about yourself in a way that resonates and is good storytelling, that's a useful tool to have. One of the things she talks about as writers is sort of the way that we can fall into comparing ourselves to others or other writers who maybe are more successful or they get published and we don't, and how that makes us feel about our writing and sort of managing all of that. So I think that's interesting to hear from as well, and to hear from her professional perspective, living the life of a writer. A lot of it was sort of about the writing process and writing multiple drafts and using the actual writing process as an extension of the thought process. So putting out sort of whatever comes to mind in those first drafts and getting it all on paper, because you really can't always get that full perspective of your thinking without those drafts and going through that. So that's interesting to think about, whereas it's not just the finished product that you're getting through, but it's the thinking that the iterations through drafts helps walk you through. You think about this in the age of generative AI and writing. If you're just going to the final product, even if it's the same potential product that you would have gotten to anyway, you're likely missing some of those iterations and writing those drafts and working through your own thought process, if you're not doing that yourself. So something to think about. She talks a lot about kind of taking notes, and I think about that in sort of the open loops concept of productivity, having a task tracker and things like that. The same type of thing for writing ideas, having a way to write those down, to take those out of your working memory and track them somewhere so you don't forget them. So again, lots of parallels there. um, she talks about giving it all each day. Sometimes when you're creating content or you're writing, I think there's a fear that you have to sort of save up some of your material, that you're going to run out at some point. But her philosophy, and I found this to be true as well, is it's sort of a self-perpetuating process. The more you're out there writing, kind of pushing yourself to write or to create or to think, the more and more ideas you get, and you don't tend to run out most of the time. And the last, I'll leave you with a quote I like from this book. Be afraid of wasting any more time obsessing about how you look and how people see you. So that's often something that holds us back, worrying about how we're going to come across, whether our content or our work will be perfect, as opposed to just getting it out there and being good enough and learning and being comfortable in that environment. And I think that that's relevant for all of us as we think about, if we want to build a personal brand, if we want visibility at work or in some effort that we're doing, having the courage to put ourselves out there, not worrying so much about what others are going to think of us. All right, last but not least, this is definitely one of my favorites, The Defining Decade, Why Your 20s Matter and How to Make the Most of Them, by Meg Jay. This was another recommendation from a colleague of mine. I absolutely love this book. Wish I had it when I was in my 20s. I think everybody in their 20s should read it. It sort of dispels the myth that, the 20s are this adventurous time where it kind of doesn't matter and we're out, finding ourselves in the world and doing whatever we want. But the reality is that, for a lot of people, it can be kind of a lonely and uncertain time and maybe not as much fun. So the author is a therapist and has worked with a number of people in their 20s, kind of facing different challenges. The book's split up in 3 different sections between work, love, and then sort of body and mind health development. And it's really interesting, going from the transition of being at school or being in college or grad school to then being out in the world. It's a big shift into more of a entrepreneurial mindset versus a very structured, like I go to this class, I do these assignments, I get good grades, I did a good job, to sort of like, hey, I'm on my own, kind of got to figure things out. So I know for me, that was an interesting transition. I wasn't as prepared for it as I could have been. It took me some time to ramp up. So I think having a book like this would have been useful and is useful for people going through that transition. And one of the things she talks about people struggling with is trying to keep their options open. And because of that, not necessarily choosing a particular direction to move forward. But then it's one of those cases where by not making a choice, you're sort of making a choice not to make progress on anything. And just the fact that if you do make a choice and you do set a goal and you work towards that, it's going to be hard work. You're going to fail. You're going to have your heart broken. You're going to have to deal with these things, whether it's in work or love or in other things that you're striving for. So talking about how you have to be willing to face those challenges and then trying to think a little bit further ahead to what you want your life to look like. Do you want to have kids? When, how old are you going to be when that happens? And what are the kind of the implications of that going to be? So sort of if you're in this mindset that your 20s is just this fun time when nothing matters, you can easily end up in your 30s without having planned for some of these things. So while it's not necessarily natural to think about them in your 20s, it's something that's important to. And as people are starting families later on average than they used to, there are some considerations to think about or even just starting careers later potentially. Again, a lot of these things for me all sort of connect together. One of the things that she talks about relates back to sort of productivity and digital minimalism and digital distraction. She talks about teaching at a semester at sea, and I'm not sure exactly when this was, but it was a time where there wasn't great internet connectivity then. and talking about how the social dynamics of the students, these were college age students at that time, was completely transformed by being taken out of the digital world that they were in and just interacting in person. So again, I see these themes through all sorts of different areas that I read, which is something why I enjoy reading broadly. You start to kind of see connections in different areas. So again, interesting thinking about the impact of kind of our digital connected world on our development and our social lives in general. So there we go. Those were all really good reads, kind of all over the place in different areas. Check them out. Let me know if you read them and you like them, or if you've read them. If you have any recommendations, send them my way. And keep reading, keep learning, and keep growing. Thanks.